The house that spoke to its owner. It was a cold November evening in the small town of Ashwood, Ohio. The air carried an unusual stillness, as if nature. The house that spoke to its owner. It was a cold November evening in the small town of Ashwood, Ohio. The air carried an unusual stillness, as if nature itself hesitated to breathe. At 7:13 p.m., Jonathan Monroe arrived at his new home after months of searching for the perfect place. He had purchased the charming two-story house on Elm Street just 3 days ago, excited about starting a new chapter in his life. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? As Jonathan unpacked his belongings, he noticed something peculiar about the house. The wooden floors creaked with a distinct pattern that almost sounded like whispers. Just old house settling, he told himself with a nervous chuckle. But the feeling persisted. It was as if the house was watching him, studying his every move. At exactly midnight, when the grandfather clock in the living room struck 12, Jonathan heard a faint voice coming from the walls. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but clear enough to make his blood run cold. "Welcome home," it said softly, as if the very fabric of the house was speaking to him. His heart raced, and he found himself glancing around the dimly lit room, trying to locate the source of the sound. Pause for dramatic effect. The next morning, Jonathan decided to investigate further. He walked through each room, noticing how the sunlight seemed to avoid certain corners, casting long shadows even at noon. In the basement, he discovered strange markings on the walls, symbols that looked ancient and otherworldly. As he traced one of the symbols with his finger, the temperature dropped suddenly, and he felt a presence behind him. Turning quickly, he saw nothing but the empty space where he had stood moments ago. That night, at precisely 2:47 a.m., the voices returned. This time, they were more insistent, calling out his name in a tone that sent shivers down his spine. "Jonathan?" "Stay," the voice whispered, followed by a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the house. He tried to sleep, pulling the blankets tightly around him, but the sounds continued. Footsteps on the ceiling above his bedroom, doors creaking open and shut despite being securely locked. Over the following days, the phenomena escalated. Objects would move on their own, appearing in different places than where he had left them. A porcelain vase he kept on the dining table would find its way to the kitchen counter every morning, no matter how many times he returned it to its original spot. The mirrors in the house showed reflections that weren't quite right, sometimes showing an extra figure standing behind him when he was alone. One afternoon, while exploring the attic, Jonathan found an old journal hidden beneath some dusty boxes. The entries dated back to the early 1900s and belonged to a previous owner named Henry Caldwell. The writings detailed similar experiences, voices in the walls, moving objects, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting, read, "I can't escape it anymore. The house knows me better than I know myself. It speaks to me now, not just in words, but in feelings. I fear what comes next." As the days turned into weeks, Jonathan realized the house was changing him. He began hearing the voices even outside its walls, as if the house had extended its influence beyond its physical boundaries. His dreams became vivid and unsettling, filled with images of faces peering through walls and hands reaching out from shadowy corners. Pause for emphasis. On December 15th, at 3:18 a.m., everything came to a head. The house seemed alive, pulsating with energy that made the lights flicker uncontrollably. The voices grew louder, overlapping each other in a cacophony of whispers and laughter. Jonathan found himself drawn to the living room, where the grandfather clock had stopped ticking. Standing before it, he felt a connection to the house that went beyond mere ownership. It was as if they shared a consciousness. "Who are you?" he asked aloud, his voice trembling. The answer came not from words, but from a deep understanding that filled his mind. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a living entity that had existed long before its physical form. It had absorbed the memories, emotions, and experiences of every person who had ever lived within its walls, creating a collective consciousness that transcended time. In that moment, Jonathan understood why the house had chosen him. It needed someone who could listen, truly listen, to its story. And though the realization brought both terror and wonder, he knew he couldn't leave. The house had become part of him, just as he had become part of it. Their fates were intertwined in ways he could never have imagined when he first stepped through its doors. As dawn broke over Ashwood, Jonathan sat in the living room, staring at the now silent grandfather clock. The voices had quieted, but he could still feel their presence, like a gentle hum beneath the surface of reality. The house continued to speak to him, not through words, but through the subtle movements of its walls, the shifting patterns of its shadows, and the ever-present awareness that he was never truly alone. The witch who tormented a family for years. The witch who tormented a family for years. It was an ordinary evening in the small town of Elmwood, nestled deep within the heart of New England. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. A chill ran through the air as autumn leaves swirled gently around the old oak tree standing tall at the corner of Maple Street. This was where it all began, a tale that would haunt the memories of one family forever. Mrs. Eleanor Carter, a kind-hearted woman in her late 40s, lived with her husband Robert and their two children, Emily and Thomas, in a modest home on Maple Street. Their house stood quietly among others, its white picket fence framing a garden filled with blooming flowers during warmer months. But this particular night felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as though nature itself held its breath. Eleanor noticed it first when she heard faint whispers coming from the attic. At first, she thought it might be the wind playing tricks on her ears, or perhaps the old pipes groaning under pressure. She dismissed it and continued preparing dinner for her family. However, as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder, almost rhythmic, like someone chanting softly but deliberately. Robert, who had been reading the newspaper by the fireplace, looked up sharply when he too heard the sound. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity, yet laced with unease. "Hear what?" Emily replied innocently, her young face lighting up as she played with her dolls nearby. Robert shook his head. "Nothing, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile to reassure her. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, sleep eluded them all. Each member of the Carter family lay awake in their beds, listening intently to the strange noises emanating from the attic. It wasn't just whispers anymore. There were tapping sounds, soft but insistent, followed by low growls that sent shivers down their spines. The atmosphere inside the house became oppressive, heavy with tension and fear. The next morning brought no relief. As Eleanor went about her daily chores, she found peculiar things happening around the house. Items were misplaced, her favorite teacup sitting atop the refrigerator, books stacked neatly in places they hadn't been before, and even the salt shaker positioned upside down on the dining table. None of these occurrences seemed accidental. They carried an air of deliberate mischief. Thomas, only 8 years old at the time, came running into the kitchen, panic evident in his wide eyes. "Mom! Mom!" he cried out, clutching a toy car tightly in his hand. "There's a shadow in my room. It moves when I'm not looking." Eleanor bent down to comfort him, her own heart pounding wildly in her chest. "It's okay, honey," she murmured soothingly. "Sometimes our minds play tricks on us." But deep down, she knew better. As days turned into weeks, the disturbances escalated. Candles flickered without cause, doors slammed shut violently despite calm weather, and cold spots appeared randomly throughout the house. One evening, while Robert was working late at his office, Eleanor decided to investigate the source of the haunting herself. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, she ascended the creaky wooden stairs leading to the attic. The moment she stepped inside, a wave of dread washed over her. The air was thick, suffocating almost, carrying a faint smell of sulfur. Shadows danced erratically across the walls, taking shapes that defied logic. Then, amidst the chaos, she saw a Heron old woman cloaked in black, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Her presence radiated malevolence, striking terror into Eleanor's very soul. "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound brave. The figure, Lafetta, chilling, guttural sound that echoed through the cramped space. "I am the guardian of this place." The woman hissed, her words dripping with venom. "And your family has trespassed upon my domain." Eleanor stumbled backward, nearly dropping her flashlight. Before she could gather her wits, the woman raised a gnarled hand, muttering words in a language unfamiliar, yet unsettlingly ancient. A surge of energy coursed through the room, forcing Eleanor to flee back downstairs. When Robert returned home that night, he found Eleanor pale and shaken, recounting the horrifying encounter. Together, they sought answers, consulting local historians and folklore experts. What they discovered chilled them to the bone. Decades earlier, a witch named Agatha Blackwell had resided in their very neighborhood. Accused of practicing dark magic, she had vanished mysteriously after being ostracized by the community. Some claimed she had cursed those who dared trespass onto her land, binding her spirit to the area long after her physical form had perished. Determined to break the curse, the Carters reached out to a renowned paranormal investigator named Henry Grayson. Known for his expertise in dealing with supernatural phenomena, Grayson agreed to help them. Upon visiting the house, he immediately sensed the overwhelming presence of negative energy. He set up various equipment, including EMF detectors and thermal cameras, hoping to capture evidence of the entity plaguing the family. Over several nights, Grayson documented numerous instances of unexplained activity, disembodied voices captured on audio recordings, objects moving independently on camera, and sudden drops in temperature that coincided with sightings of the ominous figure. Yet, breaking the curse proved far more challenging than anticipated. Grayson delved deep into research, uncovering fragments of Agatha Blackwell's past. She had been a recluse, feared and misunderstood by her neighbors. Her supposed crimes included hexing livestock and causing crop failures, though much of the evidence against her stemmed from superstition rather than fact. Still, the hatred directed toward her had driven her to desperation, fueling her desire for vengeance against anyone connected to her former life. Armed with this knowledge, Grayson devised a plan. He believed that appeasing Agatha's restless spirit might ease the torment inflicted upon the Carter family. With the assistance of a local priest, Father Michael O'Connor, they performed a cleansing ritual designed to release Agatha from her earthly binds. Under the pale light of a full moon, the ritual commenced in the attic, the epicenter of Agatha's influence. Chanting prayers and burning sage, Grayson and Father O'Connor worked tirelessly, their voices steady despite the growing intensity of the supernatural forces opposing them. Objects flew across the room, furniture overturned, and the air crackled with electricity. Through sheer determination, they pressed on, refusing to yield to the mounting chaos. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the energy shifted. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The shadows receded, and silence enveloped the house once more. Exhausted but relieved, Grayson and Father O'Connor descended the stairs to inform the Carters that the ordeal was over, or so they hoped. In the weeks following the ritual, the Carter household returned to normalcy. No longer plagued by inexplicable noises or menacing apparitions, the family breathed easier, enjoying moments together without constant dread looming over them. Yet, every now and then, Eleanor would glance nervously toward the attic door, wondering if Agatha truly remained at bay or merely biding her time. For the people of Elmwood, the story of the witch who tormented the Carter family became legend, whispered in hushed tones around campfires and shared among generations. While some dismissed it as mere myth, others swore by its authenticity, cautioning anyone who ventured near Maple Street to tread lightly, lest they awaken the wrath of a vengeful spirit once again. The ghost who solved her own murder. The night was eerily quiet in the small town of Willow Creek. It was around 10:30 p.m. when Emily Carter, a young woman in her late 20s, returned home from a long day at work. The streets were deserted, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves in the cool autumn breeze. Emily lived alone in a modest two-story house on Maple Street, just a few blocks away from the local park where children would often play during the day. As she unlocked her front door, Emily couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She paused for a moment, glancing around the dimly lit porch before stepping inside. The house seemed unusually cold, even though the thermostat was set to a comfortable temperature. Her heart began to race as she noticed that the living room curtains were slightly askew, something she was certain she had left perfectly closed earlier that morning. Taking a deep breath, Emily called out softly, "Hello? Is anyone here?" Her voice echoed through the empty rooms, but there was no response. Still, an unsettling sensation crept over her as she moved cautiously toward the kitchen. That's when she saw a faint trail of muddy footprints leading from the back door to the hallway. Panic surged through her veins, but before she could react, a shadow darted across the corner of her eye. Emily spun around, her pulse pounding wildly in her chest. There, standing in the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen, was a man she didn't recognize. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, and his hands were tucked into the pockets of his jeans. For a brief second, their eyes met, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Without thinking twice, she turned and ran toward the front door, fumbling with the lock in her haste. But it was too late. The stranger lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her backward with surprising strength. Emily screamed, struggling against his grip, but he quickly covered her mouth with one hand while pressing a sharp object against her throat with the other. "Shut up," he hissed menacingly, his voice laced with anger and desperation. Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks as she realized the gravity of her situation. This wasn't just a random break-in. This man meant to harm her. In those final moments, Emily's mind raced frantically, trying to piece together any clues about what had led to this nightmare. Had someone been watching her? Was this personal or simply bad luck? As darkness enveloped her vision, she wondered if anyone would ever uncover the truth behind her tragic fate. Days passed, and the residents of Willow Creek whispered nervously among themselves about the disappearance of Emily Carter. Detectives arrived from the nearby city to investigate, combing through her home for evidence. They found signs of struggle-broken furniture, scattered belongings, but no definitive leads. CCTV footage from neighboring houses revealed nothing more than a shadowy figure slipping into Emily's yard shortly before midnight on the night she vanished. One evening, as Detective Mark Thompson reviewed the case files once again, he received an anonymous tip via email. Attached was a grainy photo taken from a security camera at a gas station several miles away. The image showed a man matching the description provided by Emily's neighbors, purchasing snacks and fuel hours after the estimated time of her death. His license plate number was partially obscured, but enough